Scanosegwego, Jeff Doctor, Nigioso, Gaidohono of the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. So, hello. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Jeff. I'm a Kayuga Nation citizen from Six Nations of the Grand River. Our territory is also known as the Haudenosaunee Tracts. It's a wide strip of land about 6 miles deep on each side of the Grand River in southwestern Ontario, about an hour's drive southwest of Toronto. So many of you here, if you've traveled through southwestern Ontario, you probably actually passed through my people's territory. So as a citizen of the Kayuga Nation, I am not Canadian. So obviously coming into a space like this, talking about Canadian digital sovereignty always is awkward, to say the least. And I have to do a little bit of education about who I am, who the Haudenosaunee are, where we come from, and some of our original treaty relations that we have with what is now Canada. So to give a bit of context, you may or may not have heard of something called the Tura Wampum. What this effectively is a treaty that goes all the way back to the original colonization from the Dutch back in the 1600s when they first arrived in these territories, met some my people, and created this treaty relationship that we now call the Tura Wampum. The British took over those treaty responsibilities, and subsequently the Canadians, are supposed to, at least, take over this treaty relationship, but that hasn't really quite happened. Thus, the awkwardness for me when I come into spaces like this. So, what is this Tura Wampum? Easiest way to describe it, it's a visual metaphor that is also done quite physically. It literally looks like a belt, and what this belt shows is 2 rows of purple on a long background of whites. And these 2 rows, they're completely separate. They're separated by 3 rows of white, but they are completely straight, meaning they are parallel. They don't intersect, they don't touch. The white on the background is supposed to represent the endless river of life, and these 2 rows are 2 ships. One ship is the European tall ship, the other, the Haudenosaunee canoe. So this was a very brief visual kind of demonstration of what the foundation of our treaty relationship is and continues to be with what is now called Canada, is this notion that we as Haudenosaunee, we will not interfere with the Canadian tall ship. We won't steer in front of it, we won't crash into it, we won't do any of those problems because, we're still in a canoe and we're on the water together. We're all stuck, whether we like it or not, on this endless river. Now, that relationship is supposed to work both ways. The European tall ship is also not supposed to steer into our canoe. It's not supposed to cut us off. It's not supposed to crash into us. And it's certainly not supposed to destroy our canoe, throw us a life raft, and call it access. Access to what? Access to the basic necessities of life. Access to water, to our medicines, to our resources, and now the internet. So the way I see digital access is very different than I think the way that many of you may see it. I don't see it as something that obviously Indigenous peoples, if they choose, should have the availability to be able to access the internet in a fair and open way. But the internet itself still requires access to Indigenous territories. Not just the internet, but really ultimately all digital technologies require access to Indigenous territories. So this then begs the question, why are Indigenous people even paying for the internet? We may get access to it, but if we're still paying someone else's economy that they're benefiting while they're still using our lands, how is that fair? How is that equitable? How is that not a violation of many of our original treaties, not just the Haudenosaunee? So I think it's important to highlight how a lot of the infrastructure that was built under the foundation of Canada, the infrastructure that's, whether that be all of the electricity systems, whether that be all of the telephone lines, which then later become the fiber optic lines. These were all built, or at least the right-of-ways, not even talking about the larger kind of land dispossession, but just the right-of-ways. Many of these were created during a time under the very oppressive parts of the Indian Act. The Indian Act actually has been around for 150 years as of this month. 150 years of the Indian Act. It's still called that, by the way. And especially up until like the 1950s, it was incredibly oppressive. First Nations didn't have the ability to hire lawyers because it was illegal. We weren't allowed to practice our cultures. That was illegal. We certainly weren't allowed to sign agreements with land developers to ensure fair and equitable access to our territories. So much of the telephone lines, which then also become the highway systems, the railways, all of these things were built during a time when Indigenous peoples had no, quote, rights, at least under Canadian law, to say no. Maybe we were paid off, maybe we got a bit of token gestures here and there, but without the ability to say no, how is that fair and equitable access to our territories? At the same time, we don't really have very much public visibility now where this infrastructure actually is. I've been looking through different maps because I love maps, and I still struggle with actually determining where the core backbone of Canadian internet infrastructure is. I'm sure I can find it. I'm very tenacious when it comes to that. And at the same time, I certainly haven't seen any talk about how that infrastructure directly relates to treaty lands, to non-treaty lands, to extended lands, to unceded lands, to all of BC, which has no, most of it has no treaty, and yet the internet still moves through these territories. So in my backyard, along the Haudenosaunee Tract itself has a very long history. We were promised effectively full agency, full sovereignty over that entire piece of land. And there's been a lot of complicated land deals ever since then, but the gist is that so much Canadian infrastructure, so much of what, both Bell, Cogeco, Rogers, they all have core internet infrastructure that moves through the Haudenosaunee Tract. Easiest way to describe where this tract is, think Kitchener, Waterloo, Cambridge, Brantford. Brantford's not exactly known as a tech hub, but Waterloo certainly is. And that's right in the heart of Six Nations of the Grand River Territory, which is under a current actually ongoing land claim right now, which is quite complicated. But the point is, along the entire tract, did you even know that the Haudenosaunee Confederacy Chiefs Council actually has a moratorium on development across the entire tract? This was reported on a couple years ago and subsequently kind of ignored, especially when it comes to the current rollout of data centers. But the point is, back to this notion of development, digital access. The way I see it, Indigenous peoples were not underdeveloped. We're overexploited. I didn't make that up. That's been coined elsewhere. But the point is that this concept of digital access, if it violates, and I'm talking about all layers of the digital stack, if this is violating Indigenous treaties, how are we actually going to continue with that contradiction of what it means to achieve quote-unquote Canadian digital sovereignty? Is that at the expense of Indigenous sovereignty? I've been working on this concept for at least a decade now, and I started quite literally in the mud on my land. I was digging holes in the ground to find where the telephone lines were because my internet kept breaking. Because every time we would dig a hole, we'd cut through the line, and this would be my family's been on the same parcel of land for hundreds of years. It's a lot of telephone lines. Have they been documented? Of course not. So I had to go through and basically digitize where all of these lines were on my own land. This is a tiny little microcosm because none of that was written down. None of it was documented. It's just, cut the line, we'll just throw a new one in. And I just wanted to do that so I could have better internet. And that has led me down a very long story that I mentioned the Indian Act 150 years ago, but this goes way back. This goes all the way back, at least in my community at Six Nations of the Grand River, to the American Revolution. The Haudenosaunee homeland is actually upstate New York. It's the Finger Lakes region. And what is southwestern Ontario is actually our hunting grounds. It's effectively our backyard. And we were exiled here when George Washington, the great defender of freedom, he ordered his army to destroy every Haudenosaunee village they could find. You've probably heard of the Trail of Tears, but have you even heard of the Sullivan Campaign? So I'm just going to quote directly from George Washington to Major General John Sullivan, 31st of May, 1779. And bear in mind, he's talking about my ancestors here. The immediate objects are the total destruction and devastation of their settlements and the capture of as many prisoners of every age and sex as possible. It will be essential to ruin their crops in the ground and prevent their planting more. Turns out that my family's land isn't actually even part of Canada. It's never, and I'm not saying that rhetorically, I'm saying this quite legally. It's never been sold. It's never been deeded. Because when we were dispossessed of our homelands by the Americans, before Canada was even Canada, my family has been on the same parcel of land. We've never sold it. So the result of this is this strange data anomaly. We have no land title. We have no registration. We only exist based on the boundaries outside of our parcel by the other deeded properties. And one of these properties is even a parcel that an ancestor of mine was only able to effectively sell so that he could move out west because he was a land surveyor, himself having a long, complicated history in Ottawa. He was enfranchised, meaning he lost his status so that he could, quote, sell his lands. Now, my dad and his mom have bought that land back. And the funny thing is half of our property is Canadian in the sense that it has land title. The other half is Haudenosaunee because there is no land title, but of course, all of it's Haudenosaunee from our perspective because it's on the Haldeman Tract. So I see the ongoing status of where the two-row wampum is every day in my backyard. I see the violations of Haudenosaunee sovereignty that are so normalized here that I feel like even bringing it up in polite conversation, I'm considered radical. I'm not really that radical. I just know history. I know my history, my family's history, my people's history, and I know Canada's history. And this is through like very literal on-the-ground experience. I've learned how Indigenous digital sovereignty is not just about like where data like sit at rest. Like that is the most teensy tiny part of it. This whole thing about data localization is just, I'm concerned with all aspects of the digital stack because as an Indigenous person, as a Haudenosaunee that is forced to live under a colonial relationship, we have very limited autonomy or certainly jurisdiction over all of those aspects of the digital stack. And that all begins with the land. So when Canada is being threatened by the US, this is something that's like, I have a lot of very direct, both in my family and in my community and just personally, dealing with the challenge of facing threats to Canadian sovereignty. Because I'm also thinking about the threats to Haudenosaunee sovereignty by Canada. And a lot of what I've learned about infrastructure is it's actually kind of similar to sovereignty, that you don't really think about it or see it or understand it until it's threatened, until it's devastated, until it's destroyed. So while Canada's starting to begin lots of conversations about, quote, sovereignty and digital sovereignty and this and that, this is a very old discussion in my communities. You ask any Indigenous person on the street what they think about sovereignty, they'll tell you a lot of things. So this leaves me all like with such an awkward contradiction of coming to these conferences, and I'm not trying to slight anyone here. It's just so many of these spaces in Canada begin with this land acknowledgements, and then they just like start launching into like this discussion around Canadian sovereignty, whether that be again digital sovereignty, data sovereignty, whatever kind of prefix you want to use. Yet, how does that actually understand, again, in my perspective as a Haudenosaunee citizen, the two-way relationship of mutual sovereignties, plural. We're not supposed to interfere with each other. We're supposed to respect each other's sovereignty. There's never been a point in Canada's history where the Haudenosaunee were like, you know what, we're going to be Canadian now. And to be fair, some Indigenous peoples across these lands do want to be Canadian. I'm only speaking in a Haudenosaunee perspective, certainly only speaking my own personal perspective. So this isn't, quote, all Indigenous peoples. You know, it's going to depend community by community, nation by nation, but even within families, some people will identify as Canadian. That's their choice. So when we're thinking about all this, there's a lot of plurality, there's a lot of complexity that has to be thought about. That said, I'm trying to leave this on a positive note. So I'll say, I both love and hate the internet. It has been such a quintessential part of my life. Like, I absolutely loathe to watch as it becomes every day more of a liability for me and my fellow Haudenosaunee between state surveillance, corporate surveillance, lots of Canadian legislation, cough, cough, Bill C-22, and all the AI slop that is, quite frankly, and pardon the swears, but it's making everything shitty. I fear the very things that I loved on the internet are slipping away. Because I didn't grow up at Six Nations of the Grand River. I grew up under a Canadian propaganda system, aka the school system, that taught me that my people were disappearing. I was taught about people on the plains. They were called Indians. I would go home and be like, hey, Dad, I learned about blah, blah, blah. I learned about, like, the buffalo runs. And he's looking at it and he's just like, son, like, do you see any buffalo around here? Do you see any of these big cliffs? Like, you know, like, those are other people. At the same time, like, he grew up, he was in day school, but his grandfather was residential school. And there's a lot of cases where people like me didn't grow up in my community, didn't know a lot about my culture, didn't know a lot about my people, where I came from, didn't know about my family, my story, all these kinds of things. And I'm still just trying to get by in this world as a quote-unquote Canadian. And it literally, like, it wasn't until I went back home, again, and digging in the mud to find a break in telephone line so I could have a better internet, that I was like, wait, why am I doing this? Why is this not documented? Where's the magical civic authority that's supposed to know where this stuff is? And my dad's like, oh, we're responsible for that. I'm like, wait, what? It's like, oh yeah, because, you know, like, this isn't really part of Canada, blah, blah, blah. Like, we have to run our own jurisdiction here. I'm like, whoa. So now I have to learn about the Indian Act. Now I have to learn about land title. Now I have to learn so much about Canadian law and how it relates to Indigenous dispossession, rooted from, I just want a better friggin' internet. At the same time, like, the internet has helped me connect to so many brilliant Haudenosaunee people, some of which I hope are watching today. Hello, it's kind of. But also, I'm super lucky that where I work at Animikii, I work with so many different Indigenous peoples all across Turtle Island and beyond. The diversity is wild. We are not at all the same. We have very complicated views on a lot of different things. And the access that the internet has always started, because at the end of the day, the real work is in person. The real work is on the ground. It's in the mud. It's dealing with actual people face to face. But the internet can facilitate some of that if it's kept open and safe and secure and all the wonderful slogans here. So I can say with some authority that the internet, in a way, has helped me be more confident as an Anglohauen. I've learned a little bit of my language, teensy tiny bit, so can't pronounce things properly. But at the same time, I have learned about the principles of living with a good mind, in peace, in friendship. That part of the treaty obligation I'm supposed to have that binds the Haudenosaunee canoe with the Canadian tall ship. Good minds, peace, and friendship. And of course, respect for each other's sovereignty. So I've learned how to fulfill my duties as a treaty partner. And I guess the question I ask is, how do you fulfill your treaty obligations? So you know what they are. There are many treaties across these lands, and many places, including right here where we're meeting, may or may not even have a treaty. And the ones that are being negotiated right now are messy. So again, what does this mean for the internet? What does this mean to digital access to Indigenous territories? This is a severe problem that we're still dealing with and we're going to continue to deal with. I'm not here to interfere in Canadian politics. It may sound like I am, but I'm being very careful to not steer the European ship. Just as, again, under the terms of the treaty, you're not supposed to interfere with ours to steer a canoe. And you're certainly not supposed to crash into it. You're certainly not supposed to surveil it, look over, be like, hey, what's going on over there? And at the same time, all of us are being bullied by our neighbors to the south. Because again, Haudenosaunee people are on both sides of this imaginary line. Our communities are still scattered all about both Canada and America. And we're all being oppressed by the Americans as well. So I understand, I relate, I totally get this reaction to this fear of being colonized because I have to deal with it all day, every day. And not just me, so many Indigenous people know so much about sovereignty because we don't take it for granted. Because if we do, we cease to exist. So don't treat us as if we're children. We're not looking for treats. We're not looking for we actually know a lot about how to deal with and resist colonization. This isn't our first rodeo. So all I'm asking is for you to accept that fact that we know a lot, I'm saying in a very large collective way, about resisting colonization. We know what it's like to have to resist imperialism. We certainly know, multiple generations in my particular family know what it's like to resist Americans. We also know what's important to effectively encrypt aspects of our culture that were once made illegal because we don't assume it won't be made illegal again. I mean, our baskets that we weave aren't just baskets. So 150 years of the Internet Act, what has really changed? If Canada is continuing to oppress or continuing to attempt to pass oppressive laws that are ultimately replacing Indian agents with police and even corporate representatives, what has really changed in this treaty relationship or lack thereof? So all I wanted to ask is if you truly want to distinguish yourself from the Americans, from your cousins, some of you might even be American, no shade, no slight. We're all dealing with a lot of interesting people right now. All I'm asking is that you just take a look at this paternal relationship you may maintain with Indigenous peoples here. It's not an accusation, it's not me trying to be a jerk about it. I'm just saying try to think about what it means if digital access is continuing to violate Indigenous treaties. If what we need to, quote, innovate is ultimately stealing from Indigenous lands. What if Canada and Canadians are ultimately violating their own laws by building data centers, power plants, pipelines, so many things without the free, prior, and informed consent of the people whose lands you acknowledge at the beginning of events such as this? Because remember, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is the bare minimum. TRC calls to action, bare minimum. MMIWG calls for justice, bare minimum. But they're there. They're spelled out quite clearly. So we're going to continue to repeat the last 150 years of the Indian Act, but through the internet or through whatever else? Or are we going to do something different this time? Gala.